probably better that way because I feel like I'm the least design knowledgeable person in the room. So I'll let the light shine on you guys. Welcome. We were talking about both myself, Bruce. I met Orit last night as well. Michael we haven't met. Sandra we did as well. And Teresa, welcome. I mean, for me, design has always been about sort of like a journey, and you've been here, the audience has listened to you guys previously during this week and this morning. Where does the journey start for design from each one of your perspectives? I'd love to know that, just to kick it off, and then I don't know if we can open to the audience for questions, but we'll see. If either one of you, yeah.
We're going this way? Okay. Now I can see you. So, I mean, for me, it all really begins on what's meaningful to people. You have to understand what people truly desire, what people truly value. It's not about the technology, although for lots of people it is the technology that's valuable, but for 95% of the population, it's not the technology, it's something else. It's what's truly meaningful. In that, I think most of the people on this panel are going to kind of agree. And from there, you go to the stories they tell to express what's meaningful to them. And then you build and design things. So that's the beginning for me.
Yeah, for me, I would say design starts with good problem solving. I think design is really applicable when we're dealing with really messy, ill-structured problems where we don't know what our outcome is going to look like. We don't really know what the constraints are yet, and we need to dig in and really learn what's our ideal situation here and how do we allow this to take shape.
Yeah, I mean, basically I agree. It's understanding people's needs, but it's also understanding it's understanding humans. So it's not only their needs, it's also their interests. That's what I said.
You look good, Bruce.
Now I can engage with the audience without being
Can you tell he's from New York?
For sure.
Man's got style. Yeah. Well, so I'd echo everything that my esteemed colleagues here have shared. Maybe the thing that I would add is, to me, design's about conscious creation. And obviously the important word there being conscious. Right? So really being more discerning, looking at intention. What are we creating and why? And one of the things that I'm especially intrigued and passionate and also concerned about for all of us as designers and innovators right now is what I would call the ethics of the future. Right? Like, what are we actually building? Because we have more power in our hands than ever before. The things that we can do, lower costs of entry, the possibilities are endless. And we don't really have much of a vocabulary around the ethics of design or ethics of technology or of innovation and so on. But I think that this movement of human-centered design, of design thinking, is the doorway into that. It's getting us all to become more discerning and thoughtful about what are we actually building.
What can I say? You've said it all. Well, I think that I'm really glad to see that the word design is being used in contexts that are not exclusively about designers. I like it when it becomes something a tool that is manifest in a word that people think they can use in their lives, in everyday life. It's an approach. It's a thoughtful, intentional approach to solving a problem. And for people like me who deal not just with language, but mostly with language, design is also about the words you use. So for me, it's a way of solving problems in a smart, thoughtful way, a responsible way as well, as you mentioned. But it could apply to your life. You don't have to be a designer to think like a designer, I hope.
I mean, you were mentioning human-centric design. I was under the impression that humans were always at the center of design, right? You were designing for the user, for the experience. Is that not true? Has there been a change in that process? Where did it start?
Yeah, it's a great question. I would say the irony to me is we're at a time in history where we're learning how to become human again. Right? It goes by many names, like the humanization of business. In many ways, you look at the way we did business for certainly the last 50 to 100 years, and there was a mindset that was very mono-dimensional. It was very extractive. The only measurement of success was profit. And conversation is evolving, it's expanding. So, is human-centered design the perfect term? Right? It goes by many different names. Obviously, anything that you name human-centered sometimes can feel a bit pretentious, or really, do we have to give it that language? And yet, you'd be surprised. I mean, you guys know this. I mean, think of how often you've been in business meetings and situations where what maybe we take for granted about being human-centered really actually, there isn't a language or a vocabulary for it in the boardroom. And I feel like what's happening across our field right now is the development of that language, of those tools. And it's one that obviously is going to keep evolving as we all learn and apply that language.
I think that the conscious transformation happened between human-computer interface design and then human-centered design, even though I think it's a very large concept, and I don't think we're there. I think we have a long way to go, and I think that I think in order to do that, you need a lot of time to observe and to understand, and I think that all the current processes don't allow for that today enough. I would like to push that forward. So, because if you really want to do human-centered design, then you need time to understand more. So,
I think we see a lot of examples of not human-centered design. I mean, I can't argue that Wells Fargo was human-centered when they opened accounts for customers that they didn't know they had. Or that Volkswagen was very human-centered when they designed their cars to cheat on standards tests. And I think we see that pretty often, is that we tend to be more business-centered than customer-centered or human-centered. And so while it's great that we are seeing a lot of growth in human-centeredness, we have a long way to go. And I think we're just starting to understand what it means to be human-centered when it comes to developing products.
Exactly. I completely agree with you. The last couple of years I've been teaching at Parsons in New York, which is basically a fashion school. So my very first year I came in and...
Hence the hat.
Hence the hat. We'll see the light. This is bad design. So, and I think it was the first year I was there, I came into class and I started talking about user-centered design and design thinking, and I was very excited about it, and I could see a sea of faces sort of looking at me like this and like that. These were mostly fashion students. And at some point, I finally said, "What are you looking at me in that funny way?" And they said, "Well, we're fashion designers. We all have always designed for the body, for the person, for the user. This is nothing new. This is like 1,000 years old, Bruce." And I realized, for whole areas of design, they have been designing for people who use them. It's like naturally. But for engineers who are really into technology, they basically design for the technology. That's what they're into. And the paradigm for them is to create something really cool and then throw it out there to see if someone will use it. And that's why user-centered design is so new to Silicon Valley or technologists. It's new to them. But design has a whole space where people have been designing for people for a long time. So we're now at that point where, certainly in the US, user-centered design is super big, huge. After 20 years of pushing on the door is really open, and that's great. But it's open for a rather limited segment of people who would rather deal with algorithms than with other people. And we have to keep that in mind.
Right. So we've been developing a bunch of programs with C-level executives and board level and in Miami, and one of the things that it starts coming out as the word design, which is probably something they wouldn't even mention in any of their meetings. They're starting to be concerned, namely because of probably one of the biggest triggers was a generational impact of clients such as millennials that privilege very much their experience in a very conscious way. And another one was technology, very presence of technology. So how do you ignite a design-driven culture within a company? How do you make that a reality?
By getting people involved from the very beginning. There's methods that I feel can get, because I feel like you have to give people credit, okay? And I feel like a lot of I don't work for a big organization, thank God, but that's why I have my own company.
But you have clients that are big organizations,
But
right?
I do work with big organizations.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And at the end of the day, people care about what they do, okay? And they care about their work, and they have a lot of insight that they can give you. And so you have a few methods that you can use in order to get people involved. And what is design thinking? It's also creative thinking, and everyone's creative. So you have to get them on board. You have to brainstorm together. You have to listen to everyone. And you have to get everyone who's involved to commit.
How do you do that?
And then they feel like they're part of it. I think that's the idea, and there's different methods for that, so.
Do you think there's a role that, just asking you, because there's a lot of evangelizing within a certain group of people that are still see it in a very remote way, design as something that it's not embedded on the everyday, on the processes, on the culture of the company. So on a broader spectrum, how would you make that sort of like a successful product design culture?
Well, I mean, we're talking culture here, so I can't help but bring this back to stories. If you want to learn about a culture, you listen to the stories. And if you want to change a culture, you need to change the stories. Because culture literally is the stories we share in common. So what really excites me is that certainly within many of the Fortune 500s that I work with, design thinking is at the top of the list of what they want their managers to be learning. And you'd expect that, with some of our clients in Silicon Valley, like Google and Facebook and Genentech and so on, that's kind of to be expected. But we also have clients like Deloitte or Bloomberg, right? Pretty buttoned up cultures who are saying design thinking is what we want our people to learn. So I think that's the beginning, and everybody here and many of you, we're all evangelists for this. And so I think the second half of that equation is then like living and embodying it. How do you bring the principles of design thinking to life in what you're creating? Because it speaks for itself, right? When we see a product or we see a presentation or we see a service that has an awareness towards design, like on the receiving end as an audience, we get lit up about it. And the same thing happens inside the boardroom. It's just that, the modern corporation is built on the principle of risk management. Right? The first corporate charter was built as an insurance policy for sending goods across the 7 seas. So, we have a lot of old systems about managing risk. And we live in a world that's about uncertainty, about transparency, about change, which is, I think, part of the power of design-centric, creative process, which is giving voice to how to be more iterative, how to experiment, how to take risks, and so on. But that kind of culture change, doesn't happen in weeks or months. It takes years.
I think it's actually been taking decades. I mean, I think businesses are not just organized around preventing risk, but around optimizing for efficiency. And this goes back to the Frederick Taylor era of believing that our organizations are machines and that the best way to run them is to tell people what to do and have them do it as efficiently as possible. And this is completely incompatible with the way that we design. I think this is going back to what you were saying earlier, that we are all designers. If you look at any 5-year-old on the planet, they create things and they're creative. And then we send them to school where we teach them how to be cogs in a machine. And then we send them to organizations and we ask them to do the exact same things. And so as our organizations learn about things like design thinking, it's really coming up against decades of culture that is not compatible. And so I think the things that prevent us from being good design organizations is we have to reinvent the way we look at organizations and the way we work together in organizations.
Yeah, so totally agree again with everything you're saying today. It's wonderful. My experience is when you go into a corporation that's been around for more than 5 or 10 years, and you present them with things, you talk at them, they'll pay you nice money, they'll listen to you, and 97% of the time, they'll continue to do what they do. You have a much greater chance 2 ways. One, don't talk to big corporations, talk to startups. Just demographically, in terms of younger people being much more open to this. They've kind of lived a design life. They've been creating things their whole life. They've had tools their whole life. Plus, they get it. So younger companies, startups, much more open to it. If you do have to or want to work within larger corporations, having workshops, doing the experience of design is much more powerful than talking to people about design. We had an incredible workshop on Wednesday. Came up with 5 great business ideas. Seriously, really great business ideas in one day. That experience of going through the process of design, we're not even talking about design per se, is something that is really impactful and very strong. So that seems to work a little bit better in larger corporations than talking to them.
Yeah, I mean, Sandra was saying yesterday, just to add on, it was the first time I've heard someone involved in the process of billing and designing an invoice or being concerned with the experience that someone that gets an invoice from a large corporation would have and how impactful that is and how the message or the story that you're saying conveys the urgency of response or and that means that when you're designing, when you're thinking about the process, you need to understand the business as well from, so.
I think many of the challenges that we've discussed here relate to the fact that businesses are made of people, and people have fears. And you have to understand the specific fears of different people. They have different concerns and different things that are stopping them from, inviting users in. People are so scared of users. They're a nuisance. They mess things up. I recently heard about someone in a big consulting company doing a customer experience workshop, but please don't bring in any customers. It just messes things up. So, I think you have to build this sense of self-efficacy, which is a psychological concept, but the self-efficacy in people that they can do this process. Like you do the workshops, they learn to do it, and they can bring these proposals to some sort of board, and they can actually face a user and face the feedback. So the more they see themselves as able to do it, the more open they will be to this kind of processes. And when we work with trying to balance, we tend towards the user. it's natural, right? But we need to balance that with the needs and the fears of the business. And that's always a very interesting dialogue. You know, you can't force anyone, but you can't give up by not representing and advocating for the users. So sometimes we're there in the middle, pushing. But it's very useful to take the conversations all the way up to understand what are you fearing, why is this change so difficult, and what do you want to achieve. And I think that's a very important part of this dialogue. When we think user-centered and person-centered, there's people in these organizations at all levels that we need to involve as well.
All right. Thanks. We were working with a large law firm in South Florida where they actually started doing workshops internally for their attorneys. And design thinking, and they're trying to ignite innovation within the firm, for one simple reason: the basic line of their business is the billing hour. So an attorney charges by the hour and the work they do, and this has been going on at least in the U.S. for the past 3 or 4 decades. So it's really waiting there to be disrupted by something else, right? So they're trying to foster the change to come from within the group of people that, for them, design is probably not a common word and within their business. So how do you make, and I'm interested in, you mentioned, Bruce, the startups, and I work a lot with them as well. They're younger, more willing and open to implement such practices, but how do you make those, probably some of them in the audience, how do you foster the design thinking, and how do you design the future within these large organizations? Where do you start? Where is the first step there? And then we could open the questions to the public, right?
It's kind of similar to the other question.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is, I'm trying to understand if you start with the workshops that you mentioned, but how do you make that embedded into the culture of the company, and how do you make that like an ongoing thing?
Well, usually they approach you with an idea or a problem. I mean, it starts somewhere, and then you find out a little more, and you kind of sense it, and maybe they have an idea of what they want to do, but it's not necessarily the right thing. So then you offer and you say, okay, let's do. When you know enough, you say, okay, let's do. We call it like a project strategy workshop. So you get all the stakeholders involved, and you do a process where basically like everyone brings their own research to the project, and they present their own research, and then you do a creative process that like lets everyone understand what we're going to do a lot more. Yeah. And then we go home and we come back and we say, okay, is this it? Did we all understand? Are we all on the same page? Are we all on the same page? And then they say, well, I don't know. Yeah. And I think that this is like, I mean, personally, it's been extremely effective because it's like really disrupting their usual workflow. It's getting things done in a shorter amount of time, and everyone feels good. So. Right.
I'll jump in. I work with a lot of large companies, and I agree with what Bruce said in sentiment. It's much easier to get a startup to change and to adopt some of these practices, but I work with a lot of really large companies, and I see them making these changes as well. And the way that it happens is with a bias towards action. It's one of the things that I love about design thinking. It's something that the Lean Startup is giving us. It's that if we just get teams talking to customers and running experiments, the culture will change. It's really hard not to make decisions that aren't human-centered when you talk to your customers every single week. And it's really hard to ignore what you're learning when you're running experiments every single week. So even in a large organization, I simplify this problem. I want to see a team change their behavior week over week to integrate more interaction with their customers and more experiments. And if you do that team by team by team, the culture does change. And it happens a lot faster than you think.
And how do you get the board? How do you get the board and the big guys involved in those things if you're working mainly with teams?
Yeah, so obviously there's a tension when a team starts to experiment and talk to customers, and they're pushing up the hierarchy saying, hey, what you're telling us to build isn't quite working. But you know, in my experience, most executives, even when they're uncomfortable with giving up the decision-making power, if you present them with the data and you start to make the case for, hey, some of the things that we're building aren't quite right, they listen. It's that historically they haven't had access to that type of data. So I tell companies, like someone in my master class on Wednesday asked me, what do you do when you really work in an organization where you're told to build feature A, B, and C, and there's no room for design, and there's no room for experimentation? And I would say as product teams, we almost always have the ability to add tracking and instrumentation to our products. And even if you can't change what you're building right now, if you start measuring the impact of what you're building right now, you can start to tell that story up the hierarchy. I built what you asked me to build, and it doesn't work. Can we try something else? And usually when that data starts to come in, you open the door, even just a little bit, to let's learn a little bit faster that what we're building isn't working.
All right. Thanks, Teresa. We're going to open now for the audience. We have less than 10 minutes, so if anyone has questions, please raise your arm, and someone will go to you with a mic. We have someone over there, yeah. Do you mind raising? Yeah, thanks.
I can shout. Yeah. So, there's been a lot of agreement on the panel. I'm curious. There's been a lot of agreement on the panel, which is nice to hear and great, and I agree with a lot of it myself. But I'm curious about what you feel like other members on the panel might find controversial and your viewpoints on design and product.
How much time do we have?
10 minutes, apparently.
Less. Go.
I'll be real quick here. Obviously, you guys know my bias on storytelling, and the world of design really embraces storytelling, but it easily turns into buzzword bullshit bingo. All right? There's a lot of lip service that's paid to storytelling, and even in the design thinking toolkit, storytelling is the frosting on the cake. Right? Once you've gone through the whole product development process, you come out the other side, okay, now we need a story to sell it. And story is not the frosting on the cake, it's the base ingredients. Right? And bringing that awareness and narrative through every piece of all of the other areas of expertise that is part of product design and ultimately product adoption. So I think there's a huge untapped opportunity there, and continuing to advocate and bring that forward into our design communities.
I agree, but my my workshop was on that. It was on basically. It was basically on how we use brand attributes to tell a story and how that applies to the user experience, to designing the user experience. But I think that our world is like becoming we're becoming shticklers for like dogma and method, and I think that we need to watch out because I've taught for many years. And like just because someone says, well, this is the method, if someone else does it in a different way, that's fine too. So I think that there's many different methods to create great products. And probably one of the most important things is just to know who you're working with and then to understand how you're going to work with them.
So I'm writing a book, and it demystifies 13 myths that I think people commonly believe. I'm not going to outline all 13 of them, but I'm going to start with 2 that are related to design that I think will get a little bit of disagreement on the panel. So the first one is brainstorming doesn't work. I mentioned this in my workshop on Wednesday and ruffled a lot of feathers. We have about 60 years of research. All of it suggests that individuals generate more ideas on their own compared to groups of equal numbers. And we don't like to believe this because we have so many design agencies that use brainstorming as a way of including their clients. It's a fantastic way to include your clients, but if you want to create creative ideas, you should work individually and then share as a group. So that's the first one. And then the second one is we like to think that product managers own the problem and that designers own the solution. And we also have actually more than 60 years of research, about 200 years of research thanks to design fields like architecture, that tells us that as we explore the problem space, it changes the potential solutions we can explore, and as we explore solutions, it feeds back into how we understand the problem. And when we separate those two roles across two different people, we cut off those feedback loops. And so the reality is we have to collaborate. We can't let product managers own the problem and designers own the solutions. Yeah?
Yep.
I mean, I'll counter you on the brainstorming, and not because, like, maybe, maybe. But how do you measure that? How do you measure that kind of research? That just seems like questionable.
Yeah, so the way they measure the research is they take, first, the way that most of the research was conducted is they take 4 people in one group and 4 people in another group. And for the 4 people in one group, they're working individually. And then the 4 people over here are working in a group using traditional brainstorming methods. And they have independent judges look at the quantity of ideas generated and the quality of ideas generated. In the research, there's 3 different dimensions in which creativity is. Here's the thing, it's pretty good research. And here's what I'll say, I'll argue the other side. Here's what I'll say. Brainstorming might work if, like, this is the design agency argument. If you're trained in brainstorming, it's a skill you have to develop, it might work. Okay, I buy that. Where's the research? And here's what really gets me. The Stanford D School, I went to Stanford as an undergrad, and it's still really, and I learned design there. The Stanford D School proselytizes brainstorming. They're an academic institution. Get their experts to brainstorm as a group and compare it to them brainstorming as an individual. Let's look at the data. But here's the bigger point. Why are we dogmatic about this? Yeah, right?
Then that's the point, is that brainstorming sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Let's not be dogmatic about it.
Sometimes works, maybe.
Depends who you are. Depends what kind of person you are. Depends what your group is like, At the end of the day, it's people, right?
Yeah.
So, like, it's like what the best way for them as individuals is to work together.
That was a good.
One thing really quick. I would love to see the data.
See?
All I would say is I would love to see the data where brainstorming does work. I haven't seen it, right? I see people saying it works, but there's also studies that show that brainstorming makes you feel like it works even when your quality isn't as good.
Can I just say something? Sounds like you're creating like a... It sounds like you're creating a false dichotomy here, because you can have both in the same session, right? That's how we do it at Claro. We start by working individually. Everyone sits in one corner, works individually for quite a bit, and then when we think we run out of ideas, we try a bit longer, and then we get together. So you don't have to get rid of brainstorming or,
Exactly.
It's a false dichotomy. There's no research on this, sorry.
So that was a really bad boy, good question to start a.
Guys.
But I'm with her. I think brainstorming is, the origin of brainstorming sort of came out of marketing and in the U.S. in the 30s. There's no real science behind it, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. My only experience with brainstorming is that I was thrown out of a brainstorming session at IDEO once. And the session, they structured it, you can only do yes and, right? It's a building thing, yes and. But I have a yes but personality, so I kept saying yeah but, and finally they just threw me out. So I have kind of a prejudice about that. The other prejudice I have, we'll just talk about prejudices. So I was a big proponent of design thinking when it came, and it was hugely powerful. Because design thinking basically, at that point, sort of, late 90s, early aughts, took us into designing experiences and engagements and away from simply designing artifacts. And it was a revolution and very powerful. But over about 10 years, it became bureaucratized and fossilized and became a process. And, you know, large corporations, as you know, work by process. And they began taking the process of design thinking and just plugging it in. And they're doing it again. Plug it in, we're process people, give us a process for design, and we'll plug it in. With the assumption is, well, if you plug it in, and we move down the funnel, at the end of the funnel, if we do everything right, we're going to have great innovation. It doesn't work that way. You might get some incremental innovation, but you're not going to get anything disruptive. So thinking like a designer is a much better expression for me than design thinking. You know, putting on a hat because the light was in my eyes, that's a design process, really. But it's not a big funnel of a whole bunch of things that I would call design thinking. So, there.
All right, guys, with that, we'll give it a wrap. Thank you so much for